Welcome back to the Deep 404. I've had a few days off. I've been away with my family and some friends to the beach camping for a couple of days, which was amazing. Really good bunch of people, big bunch of kids, had a lot of fun at this lovely spot. Amazing coastline, sandy beaches, just body surfing for days. It was great. And a lot has happened. I was out of mobile range for about 4 days, and when I came back and checked social media, wow, a lot has gone on. I'm not going to try and cover everything that's happened over the last week or so, but just a couple of the bigger points. Just try and catch up myself with where things are. Obviously, a big piece of news is that the Sergei Kotov, another Russian warship, has been sunk by Ukrainian drones. Now, in mid-February, the Caesar Kunikov was sunk, but the Sergei Kotov is a more valuable target. The reason for this is that it is capable of firing Kalibra missiles, and the Kalibra missiles that it fires are the NK variant. Now, the NK variant, these Kalibra missiles, they're fired, I believe, from what's called a VLS, a vertical launch system, and they have a range of 3,000 kilometres. No, sorry, they have a top speed of Mach 3 and a range of 4,000 kilometres. They can fly as low as 10 metres. They will do automatic terrain and ground hugging. They can be controlled in flight, and they can make up to, which this is an unusual number, but reportedly up to 147 turns within their flight. Now, I don't know why that number is given as a limit, but even if that is a limit, you can imagine that might be part of its pre-programmed flight path, where it's not actually being directly controlled by someone at that time. That would make it quite difficult to infer its end target if it is constantly changing direction, perhaps almost flying past a target before circling back on it to give the illusion it's going somewhere else. Anyhow, the Sergei Kotov was sunk. It was reportedly, if I've got my screen going here, just one moment. There we go. But they were sunk by these Magura V5 maritime drones. So there's some pictures of them there that you can see. Reports are that there were a number of these drones involved in the attack, and perhaps that is what happened here, is that the Sergei Kotov was overwhelmed, unable to account for the number of drones that were attacking it. The reports are it was hit on a number of sides, and this ultimately led to its sinking, possibly the death of 7 crew members. I'm not quite sure if that's accurate, but it does appear that this Russian warship has been sunk. Now, this does raise the larger picture or question about navies in general. I saw some ex-US generals who are prominent on X and Twitter, talking about this, saying how the Russian Black Sea fleet does a really good job on the bottom of the sea floor and all that, which is, it's fine for them to joke about it. However, the reality of the situation is that the British and the American and the Chinese navies will suffer the same fate if they get into a conflict where they have a foe who has a large number of modern sea drones capable of doing just this thing, overwhelming a warship. Now, no doubt all the navies around the planet are currently scrambling to figure out ways to counteract this, because you just can't continue as a navy if it is unsafe for you to send your boats out into the ocean, because they may come under attack of these drones. So that's a big thing. This is a big loss for let's say not a big loss in terms of the overall outcome of the conflict, but an embarrassing loss for Russia, particularly how this is happening now one every month for the last couple of months. This is something which Russia needs to figure out a way around, how to protect its fleet, or how to use its fleet without these being a challenge. Now, I think part of the solution to that will be the ultimate capture of Odessa and Mykolaiv, that region of the Black Sea, which Ukraine currently has access to, and which is where it is launching its Magura maritime drones from. I think that Russia is already moving towards plans to crossing the Dnieper, taking Mykolaiv and Odessa, and cutting off this threat to the Black Sea fleet. Now, that will stop the immediate threat, which is going on as part of this current war with Ukraine, or special military operation with Ukraine. It won't, however, stop the problem forever. This is an ongoing problem now that navies around the planet will need to address, in much the same way that we have seen the development of the cope cages on tanks from the Ukrainian conflict, and how we saw that as soon as the Israeli forces started after October 7th with their movements into Gaza, that they immediately adopted the cope cages on some of their Merkava tanks. This, I think, we will see that type of evolution of protective measures we will see everywhere. No doubt it will come to navies as well. It may, though, lead to a decrease in size of navies. They may move away from these big, powerful, expensive, somewhat delicate boats and ships, and move to fleets of smaller, autonomous, swarming drones. Maybe what the future looks like for navies. So that was a big piece of news in the last couple of days. Other one, Victoria Nuland, her boss, US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, has announced that she will be retiring. So Victoria Nuland was operating as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs for the United States. She's got many nicknames, the Cookie Monster, the mother of the Maidan, that type of thing. She was instrumental in the 2014 coup in Ukraine, which led to the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and then the conflict in the Donbass, which started in 2014, which has now evolved into Russia's invasion into Ukraine and the special military operation. Just as a little bit of history there were in January and February of 2014, there were clashes, riots. They actually started in 2013, in November of 2013 from memory, and went through into February. These protests were known as the Euromaidan, and they began in response to then President Yanukovych's decision not to sign a free trade agreement with the EU. Now, the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament, had agreed that this would happen. Yanukovych, however, had listened to Russian influence and decided not to do this, and instead was going to take an approach to strengthen ties with Russia. Now, this was the catalyst for riots. These riots ended up in the death of 108 protesters and 13 police officers. There have been some reports that have come out just recently indicating strong CIA and American involvement in this coup. There is the infamous 2014 phone call between Victoria Nuland and the then Ukrainian ambassador Jeffrey Pyat. They talk in there about how they are looking for their preferred candidate to go into elections. Victoria Nuland says, talking about Klitschko, who's now the Ukraine mayor, saying that she doesn't think Klitsch should go into the government. She don't think it's necessary. She doesn't think it's a good idea. So clearly the United States had their own plans for what would happen in Ukraine in 2014. And this led to that coup. Again, about a week ago, we've got sort of confirmation of what people have long thought, that there was a strong CIA presence in Ukraine, with the announcement that there have been a dozen CIA bases along the border of Ukraine and Russia since at least 2016, and from 2014 there has been US, NATO, UK private military companies operating in Ukraine, training Ukrainian servicemen, training them on NATO equipment and NATO techniques, strategy, tactics, doctrine and operations, and all of that sort of thing. So Victoria Nuland, the nickname of the Cookie Monster is because during the protests she was there. In Kiev, she was there, seen handing out cookies from paper bags and plastic bags. She has later said that she wasn't handing out cookies, she was handing out sandwiches. But regardless, people question, why was she there at all? And again, this just seems to be another case of US interference in another nation's elections. But she has now resigned. Maria Zakharova, the Russian spokesperson, has come out, and foreign ministry spokesperson has said that she believes that Victoria Nuland is stepping down now because of the failure of her pet project, which is this Ukrainian project, this plan to turn Ukraine into a NATO member and against Russia. Seeing how that conflict is failing now in Ukraine, it looks as though Victoria Nuland's plans have not worked out, that these are leading to her suffering pressure, and that she has left for that reason. Also, this being sort of her baby to a large extent, the failure of the Ukraine experiment is impacting negatively against Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden is running up to an election in November. Today was the big, in the United States, was the big Super Tuesday. So there were a whole heap of primary ballot elections in states across the United States. Now, not all of them, I don't know, I'm guessing maybe about 20 or 30 of them perhaps voted today. There are a few that haven't. Some have already voted. Trump cleaned up in that today. He actually just a couple of days ago won a Supreme Court case. That case was brought by Trump and his attorneys because the state of Colorado had tried to disqualify Trump from being on the primary ballot to be able to win votes in Colorado. The Supreme Court said that while the Colorado state could determine who they put onto state ballots, in terms of federal elections, they had no jurisdiction. So that was shot down. Trump smashed Colorado. All of the states that he was entered into, he won today, apart from there are two that he hasn't won, one previously and one today. He didn't win in Vermont. Vermont, I believe the reason he didn't win there is because their Democratic politicians can vote for Republicans, and so Democratic politicians actually voted for Nikki Haley to get her in. So instead of them not voting, they voted for Republican Nikki Haley to try and thwart Trump. And so there, Vermont, that happened. And in the District of Columbia, so in Washington, D.C. itself, Nikki Haley has won there, but that's not surprising with a strong Democratic presence there. So all of this happens on the same day that a video rises of Joe Biden at some after some conference. The crowd and reporters are trying to ask him some questions. He uncertainly reaches for a microphone, picks it up, says, "Oh, I better not start any questions, I'll get in trouble," puts the microphone down and just looks completely confused and uncertain for 20 seconds or so while his handlers and assistants clear the room of reporters. It was sad to watch, really. This is an old man who's suffering from dementia and shouldn't be put into these positions, yet the Democratic Party in the United States is still wheeling him out as their candidate for the election. So all of that pressure adding on to the extra pressure of the failed Ukrainian campaign, adding pressure to Joe Biden and Victoria Nuland, and looks like Victoria Nuland is out. Other things. Now, we've talked about this before, but I want to talk a little bit more about Kaliningrad. Let me just, if I can get the... There we go. There we go. So this is the Baltic Sea, and this is just showing the area of Kaliningrad and the Suwalki Gap. This little red line here. So it runs between the border of Poland and Lithuania, and Kaliningrad and Belarus. I'll just step back to another image for a moment. This one here gives you the wider picture. So the Baltic Sea, Norway, Sweden, Finland up here, then Russia down the right-hand edge, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, Belarus here, and Kaliningrad. Now, apart from Belarus, Kaliningrad, which is an oblast of Russia, so apart from Belarus and Russia, everyone here now is NATO. Poland, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all NATO nations. And that is what is putting all of the focus and pressure on this little Suwalki Gap, this line down here. Now, Poland is today, as part of the steadfast defender exercises that have been going on and will be running for another couple of months, up until May, I believe. These are the big NATO exercises, 90,000 troops there. Poland is running some exercises today on its border with Kaliningrad along here. Apparently 20,000 troops, at least 100 tanks in the front first echelon, and they are working on exercises for crossing rivers and things. Now, there are areas where rivers border Kaliningrad and Suwalki, so these exercises are to plan for Polish forces invading Kaliningrad. So this is happening right now. Now, over the past few months, there have been multiple reports of failure of the GPS navigation system around the Suwalki Gap. Now, this is believed to have been done by the Russians, one way or another, them demonstrating their electronic warfare capabilities and being able to disable in these regions GPS. This is a threat to NATO. NATO runs on the GPS service for navigation. So without that, they would struggle to operate as efficiently as they would like. Now, the Suwalki Gap is also extremely important because if a fight does kick off between NATO and Russia, well, obviously Russia wants to protect Kaliningrad. This is a part of Russia. If I just jump to the other map, this is Kaliningrad down the bottom here. Kaliningrad is very vital to Russia. Russia has only two ports on the Baltic Sea. Here it has St. Petersburg and it has Kaliningrad. Now, the beauty of Kaliningrad for the Russians is that Kaliningrad doesn't freeze during the winter, whereas St. Petersburg does. So it's Russia's only year-round port on the Baltic Sea. Now, transport between Kaliningrad and Belarus, which needs to travel either through Poland or through Lithuania to get to Belarus, and then from Belarus it can travel into the larger Russia. Lithuania has since 2022 enforced restrictions on goods being transported across Lithuania to Kaliningrad. These are EU sanctions were put in place, and so they have limited the amount that can be transported across there. Obviously, Russia doesn't want these limitations in place and would like to have free access to Kaliningrad through Belarus. So this Suwalki Gap here, it's only about 65 kilometres long, becomes vitally important. It is quite possible one of the positions that if a conflict between NATO and Russia does begin, where it might begin. Because for Russia, their concern is that if this gap is completely controlled by NATO and Kaliningrad is cut off, then Russia has an oblast which is isolated, completely isolated. It's effectively under siege and can be starved out because the entire Baltic Sea is surrounded now by NATO nations. So they can throttle any sea-based access from Kaliningrad, and it would be completely blocked off by Lithuania and Poland from having access to Belarus and Russia. So the Russians don't want that to happen. Now, on the flip side, the NATO nations, and in particular Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, don't want Russia to control the Suwalki Gap. Because if Russia takes the gap and connects Belarus to Kaliningrad, suddenly Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia are now locked off from access to Europe. They can no longer travel down through Poland into Europe. Instead, they are now limited only to sea travel through the Baltic. So both sides have got a lot to lose or a lot to gain by controlling the Suwalki Gap. And that is why I think this area here is worth watching, and why it is interesting that Poland are just putting pressure on this point by conducting these military exercises right along the border here. Now, no doubt the Russians will be watching very closely what happens there. But if NATO were to invade Kaliningrad, then that would kick off a wider NATO and Russia war, because while it's known as Kaliningrad, it is actually Russia. It is an oblast of Russia. What else have we got going on here? Iran and BRICS. So over the last, over the last 6 or 8 months, we've talked a number of times about BRICS and its de-dollarization initiative. Its desire to develop a trading currency, a framework for trading amongst BRICS nations, and a currency. And now Iran has raised a proposal to create an equivalent to the SWIFT banking system. So the SWIFT payment system allows for global international bank settlement payments. That's done internationally through the SWIFT system. So Western control of the SWIFT system, much like the US dollar being the global reserve currency, gives the US and the West power against these nations to enforce financial, monetary sanctions on them. Countries like Russia and this can be cut off from the SWIFT settlement system. Now, because everyone has adopted it, that means that if Russia wishes to trade with someone and settle that payment, that's done through the SWIFT system. If they're cut off from that, they now need to convince another country to settle payments in some other way. And there's obviously challenges around doing that. So Iran has now brought a proposal to BRICS to create an equivalent, a BRICS version of SWIFT, to allow the BRICS nations to settle their interbank payments amongst themselves without the need for the SWIFT system. This takes away this tool from the West, sanction tool from the West, because if they can now settle their own payments, and the BRICS nations are trading in their own local currencies now, moving away from using the US dollar. Again, this de-dollarization effect takes away the weaponized power of the US dollar. In the past, where for example, all oil payments would be paid for in US dollars, the US could enforce a sanction on a nation and say, you're not allowed to use US dollars, you can't buy or sell in US dollars. That nation is then stuck if they want to buy oil, because you have to pay for it in US dollars. If they're not allowed to use US dollars, they can no longer buy oil. So because everyone trades in the US dollar, it's the global reserve currency, it has that power. Now, BRICS is breaking that power down, because they are now saying, well, if you want to trade with us as the BRICS nations, buy oil from us, we'll settle it in other currencies. We'll settle it in Chinese RMB or in rubles or in Indian rupees or whatever it might be. That's now an option that you have, which means that the likelihood of a US sanction against nations is decreased. So It's interesting that this proposal has been bought by Iran, and BRICS is adding it to their agenda. So they are adopting it. They are now going to put on their agenda. One of their items that they will work towards doing is to replace the SWIFT system. Other big sort of interesting news this week, obviously a story about the German generals, Air Force general and some of his subordinates, talking about the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine and the possible targeting of the Kerch Strait Bridge and the admission that the English and the French do have soldiers in Ukraine, and that they're involved in mission planning and advising and that sort of thing. This is an embarrassment for the German military. Apparently, one of the participants in the call was in Singapore, and they were using WebEx. WebEx is a video conferencing tool, not reportedly one of the German authorized secured tools, but they were using WebEx. And one way or another, either through Russian or Chinese perhaps eavesdropping, or even Singaporean eavesdropping perhaps, given that one of them was in Singapore, it's possible that's where this recording came from. But a recording was made, a 38-minute long recording of their conversation. It was leaked out to the director of the Russian RT news channel. They posted that on Telegram. And the German authorities have confirmed that it is an actual recording. There is a lot of now German talk about this topic. The talk is about, well, how did this security breach happen? And this is really bad. And we'll do a big investigation into this. Less talk about the fact that they were talking about supplying what would be long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine and assisting them and targeting the Kerch Bridge and things like that. Now, the Kerch Bridge is considered by Russia to be Russian territory. It's at a range where quite possibly they are talking about using the longer range Taurus missiles here. That in the conversation, it was General Ingo Geratz. He and his subordinates were questioning the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's position on Taurus missiles, saying it was confusing, and I guess get these military guys ideally suggesting that the Taurus missiles should be sent so that they could fire them at something. But this has led to further diplomatic breakdown between Germany and Russia. Reports that the German ambassador to Russia has come under fire for this. This comes also just after European foreign ministers refused to speak to Sergei Lavrov and Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy of the Russian Security Council and former former president of Russia, has come out and spoken about that. These are just further deteriorations between these nations, moving them further apart from being able to begin to talk, negotiate, and move to some way to get out of this conflict. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also reportedly in yesterday's news has said that it was just Russian propaganda that Russia and Ukraine had in the Istanbul conferences actually reached agreement on negotiating an end to the conflict back in March, April of 2022, right at the start of this conflict. Now, President Putin has said that this was a case. He mentioned that in the interview with Tucker Carlson. There have been a number of other people, even people on the Ukrainian side, who have mentioned that this actually did happen. Negotiations were proceeding. And one of the interesting things about those negotiations was that there was no mention of those negotiations involving Russia assuming control of all of the Ukraine. Now, this is an important point. This is a point that John Mearsheimer brought up in a discussion or an interview with Piers Morgan recently, just in the last week or so, when Piers was saying, well, why do you believe Putin when why do you believe that he doesn't want to capture all of Ukraine and then keep going and take Poland and Germany and ultimately end up here in the UK? And he didn't say that, I was paraphrasing, but that's what he was inferring. And John Mearsheimer said, well, there's no evidence for it. And he said, let me just bring to your attention that in these negotiations that were going on and which reportedly got to the point of just about being completed before Boris Johnson, the then UK Prime Minister, spoke to Zelensky and said, don't sign that. It's not happening. We'll support you in a war with Russia. That those negotiations did not include any criteria that Russia would take control of Ukraine. It seems, as seems quite obvious, Russia was looking to negotiate to stop the conflict, and that what they were going to require was that Crimea would, of course, remain as Crimea. The areas of the Donetsk and Lugansk areas, that Donbass region, they would gain their independence, and that Ukraine would remain a militarily neutral nation. They would not join NATO. They seem to be the big criteria. So this is, if this is true, this is, as far as we can tell, that is accurate. If it is, then that does add weight to the story that there is no evidence that Russia was looking to take all of Ukraine, and that they're, for example, Piers Morgan, where he's saying, well, why would you believe Putin when he says he doesn't want to take all of Ukraine? Well, for that reason, because it appears as though the Russians and the Ukrainians negotiated to a point almost to conclusion, and there was no requirement in there for Russia to assume control over Ukraine. Now, that was in March and April of 2022. We're now in March of 2024, 2 years later. Things have changed. Now, I'm not saying that they have changed such that Russia now wants to take all of Ukraine, but I do think that they have changed now that Russia will take more of Ukraine now. That is Odessa, Mykolaiv, and the oblasts to the east of the Dnieper River. I believe that they will look to take that now. Whether that is done by force over the next couple of years, or whether that occurs via negotiation in a shorter time frame, who can say? Hopefully the latter. Again, that will result in a lot less death and destruction in Ukraine. But that, I believe, is a result of the 2 years of conflict and of Russia realizing that they're not going to be able to negotiate a way out of this early. And these drone strikes originating from Odessa on the Black Sea fleet, that will force Russia to capture Odessa and Mykolaiv, and to take everything to the east of the Dnieper River, to just set a natural border between what remains of Ukraine. And because those east of the Dnieper oblasts tend to be ones which are more ethnically Russian than those to the west, which are more ethnically Ukrainian in their makeup. So, yeah, that's going on. In some other Ukrainian news, there's some interesting reports coming out from the Washington Post talking about the missing 700,000 soldiers. Now, Ukrainian President Zelensky's office recently announced that 1 million people had been mobilized, but of those 1 million people, only 300,000 have fought at the front lines. Now, something's wrong with these numbers, because the numbers coming from Zelensky just don't make sense. So he's saying only 300,000 have fought at the front lines, but 1 million have been mobilized. So there's 700,000 sitting unaccounted somewhere. Now, at the present time, we're getting reports from Ukrainians in the field saying they are struggling to replenish their fallen comrades, that people are being killed and wounded at a high rate, and they're unable to resupply and restock, and that lots of their battalions are operating at 50% strength or 25% strength, whatever it might be. So if there were 700,000 mobilized troops sitting around, you would think they would be pushed into conflict now. They would be helping to drive the Russians back as they're making their multiple advances across the front line. So there's a couple of things here. either there's 700,000 Ukrainian troops sitting around in cafes just waiting for something, which doesn't seem to be the case because no one's indicating that. There's been zero evidence of that given. Or there never were those 700,000, and that the mobilisation has been a complete failure and has been a failure for a long time. And that there was the original army, and then after that, the Ukrainians have struggled to mobilised. Now, we know they have problems. They've got this ongoing bill in the parliament trying to get it pushed through. It's looking to reduce the age of mobilisation from 27 to 25 and bring in a whole heap of other new amendments which would widen the people that could be mobilised. So getting that bill through has been a struggle. Apparently there's been well over 1,000 amendments made to it already. So maybe there never were the million people mobilised, or if there were, then maybe a lot of them have been killed and wounded. Now, I'm not saying all 700,000 of them have been killed or wounded, although that number is perhaps and probably closer to the actual number than the number of 31,000, which President Zelensky suggested had been killed last week. So Zelensky's 31,000 dead Ukrainians number is just unbelievable. In a previous video, which I titled "Just How Many Men Have Ukraine Lost?", I took the best Russian figures that we can get for Russian losses in terms of those killed, and then worked through discussing a number of factors where Russia held superiority to Ukraine, like in terms of air support, air force, artillery, number of artillery shells, number of ammunition pieces, long-range missile strikes, things like the TOS flamethrower systems, all of these sort of things, which would indicate that Russia would be doing better in the conflict than Ukraine. And so from that, I got to an estimate, I think, of somewhere between 210 and 280,000 killed, dead Ukrainian soldiers in this conflict. What this thing about the missing 700,000 soldiers, it might be a nothing burger. You know, it might simply be Zelensky's office just making up the number of 1 million having been mobilized. Unfortunately, if that is an accurate number, that 1 million have been mobilized, well, then it's possible there's more than 300,000 that have fought on the front line. Maybe it's 500,000 have fought on the front line, but that still leaves 500,000 unaccounted for somehow. Now, in some reporting from a couple of days ago, where I read from a Ukrainian channel where they were commenting, this is a Ukrainian channel, not a Russian channel, a Ukrainian channel commenting on Zelensky's figure of 31,000 killed. They were suggesting that technically Zelensky might be right in that the 31,000 are the officially accepted number of killed Ukrainian servicemen, 31,000. But this Ukrainian channel went on to say they believe that there was upwards of 50,000 where their families were pursuing the government to confirm the death. You know, that like maybe they had been dead, the process had started, but it hadn't been completed with recognition, official recognition and payment out to the families. Another 50,000, and then they were saying maybe another 90,000 who are just currently marked as missing, just unaccounted for. Now, their commanders and their colleagues may know full well that many of them are dead, but it hasn't travelled back through the bureaucracy. And at this stage, they're just marked as missing, even though there may be like 100,000 out there dead. So this Ukrainian channel was suggesting, well, that it might be more like realistically like 180,000, 170, 180,000. Based on what they feel. Like I said, my numbers, just extrapolating stuff out, was 210 to 280. So maybe it's somewhere around that 180, 200,000 dead Ukrainians, which is a terrible number. Anyhow, so that was something. That was a piece of news too. Moving on to something, and I might just finish up here for the day, but something a little lighthearted, but interesting. An announcement that China and Russia are looking to collaborate on building a nuclear reactor on the moon. The head of Russia's space agency, Roscosmos, has said that they are looking to build by 2035 is when the project would be completed. This is from Borisov, who is for the head of the Russia Space Agency. He said by between 2033 and 2035, they would likely have the project done, and it would be completed without the presence of humans. So he said technology that would automate the nuclear power plant's construction is nearly ready. So here talking about, robots, I guess, constructing this, some modular power plant design. What size it is isn't specified. I imagine it's going to be as small as possible because it's going to be very expensive to get something heavy like that up into space. They believe this will be used to power future lunar settlements because using solar power would just not give them enough energy to be able to do that, to produce enough electricity. And he said that Russia is also developing a nuclear-powered space tugboat that can transport cargo from one orbit to another and that collects space debris or engage in many other applications. So there are low Earth orbits that you can get into. There are points around a planet called Lagrange points where you can, if you push something to that point, they will hold there, they'll stay there. They're somehow balanced by gravity and the centripetal force of which they are moving. Anyhow, so it looks like the Russians are planning on building a space tugboat, so you could send satellites and equipment up to a certain orbit where you can hold it there, then the tugboat will come down and grab them, then pull them up to where they need to go, to the moon in this case. So there has been some activity on the moon. Now, last week, the Americans managed to land a lunar lander there. However, there was suggestions right from the start that the landing wasn't great. Apparently, it landed heavily, broke a leg on the unit, and that has caused it to now go dormant. Exactly why, I don't know. Perhaps the broken leg caused some loss of energy or caused it not to be able to orient itself. Quite likely it's solar powered. If it was not able to orient itself towards the sun to draw energy, its batteries may have just not lasted that long, but it has apparently now gone dormant, so I imagine that means its mission is over. China had a similar problem just recently, maybe January or end of 2023. Same thing, lost control of a lander. However, the Indians have, with the Chandrayaan-3 in August of last year, of 2023, they've had the first successful soft landing on the moon. So 2033 to 2035, Russians talking about putting a nuclear reactor that's 11 years away. Now, in the scheme of things, that isn't far, so I expect we will hear more about the moon in the coming years. All right, it's good to be back doing shows again. I will get some more out later this week. I have, now that I've reached 1,000 subscribers on the channel, thank you for all of you who have subscribed and are enjoying the channel. I feel really stoked if people are enjoying the channel. I have set up memberships now. Actually, have got my first member. So on them, if you do choose to be, you can have a look on the channel page, but if you do choose to get a membership, I'm going to start to put up there some member-only stuff. Will be the main thing I'll be doing there, member-only videos, a bit more behind the scenes, a bit more about me. People have been asking to learn a little bit more about me. So I'll be doing that sort of thing, and even moving up towards, on the membership levels, doing some private live streams with people, that sort of thing. Okay, I hope you're having a good week. I will be back soon. I look forward to talking to you then.